Hi everybody, well here it is, it's the penultimate episode of my Beatles and solo ultimate ranking videos. What a journey it's been. I started this about 5 months ago with a series of Paul McCartney videos. I then decided I was going to throw John Lennon, George Harrison and Ringo Starr into the mix. By the end of this video I will have a full list of album rankings for the 4 solo members of the Beatles, and then there's one more video to come where I will throw the Beatles into the mix as well. So this is the second part of my Ringo journey. The first part, thank you very much for all your comments on that. Here is the ranking so far of the albums that I did. I went back chronologically and I went back as far as Time Takes Time from the early 90s. And I felt that that was a good cut-off point because that was very much the start of, I think, the modern phase of Ringo albums. So here we are. I am now going back the previous album to Time Takes Time. I have included, and I've even got a copy of it specially for this video, Ringo Starr's All-Star Band. This was the first All-Star Band album following the first All-Star Band tour. This album came out in 1990, and it was actually the first time really that Ringo had properly toured since the Beatles split, or since 1966. So it'd been well over 20 years since he'd been touring, and it's an interesting album. Again, I've got my notes here because there's so much to get through here. But I'm going to focus on the Ringo songs on this album mainly. But what I will say is that The Wait, the song originally by the band, that's sung by Levon Helm here. And that's, for me, is the standout of the non-Ringo songs, definitely. And I got the impression from this album that Ringo set out straight away to create a show where the audience are going to have a good time. This isn't an artistic statement like a Pink Floyd show or a Radiohead show. This is good time rock and roll. And we've got early on in the album, It Don't Come Easy in the No No song. Just well played, faithful renditions. No surprises there, but fun opening to the album. We've got a cover of Honey Don't, which of course Ringo covered on Beatles for Sale. And it's a good up-tempo rock and roll arrangement, fun to play. Nothing like the way that the Beatles did it, but I've no doubt that would have got the crowd dancing, definitely. You're 16, You're Beautiful in Your Mind, another good, fun rock and roll arrangement. You've got Clarence Clemens there, one of the great sax players. He does a good sax solo in this, but I felt like it was slightly restrained. I wanted him to let himself off the leash a little bit. That never quite happened. And at the end, we've got Photograph, a real good rousing send-off with probably the obvious song for Ringo to finish on a solo gig. Overall, an enjoyable album, much more so than I expected it to be. Ringo's clearly enjoying being back on the road. As I said, not really done anything since the Beatles days, apart from the odd show here and there. I would have liked to have seen more Beatles songs on this, things like Yellow Submarine, With a Little Help from My Friends, Octopus's Garden, but a lot of the Beatles songs would follow on later All-Star Band albums. But overall, a good album, and I'm putting that in 6th place. Now, Ringo had a lot of the 1980s off. He was not particularly having a great time health-wise. He was also busy being the voice of Thomas the Tank Engine as well, of course. So we have to go back to 1983 for Ringo's previous album, Old Wave. Obviously a pun on New Wave, which wasn't even really that new by 1983. In My Car, good solid opener. Feels a little bit more contemporary sounding than what was on a lot of the previous couple of albums. Obviously, I'm going to come to those soon. So it was nice to hear him sounding a little bit more up to date there. Hopeless, that was a nothing song. Could be argued to be catchy, but I thought for what purpose? I couldn't really understand the reason for it being there. Alibi was a bluesy song that felt like it was going to be something quite big but never quite got there. Be My Baby felt like it was trying to be modern. It's got like vocoder and synth wah effects, but it's missing the mark by several years. It feels wrong for 1983. I felt that something like this, give it to Stevie Wonder in the mid-70s and he would have done something really good with it. But 1983, I wasn't convinced that it felt right for that era. She's About a Mover, 12-bar blues rocker. It's good New Orleans style jazz solo instead of a guitar solo, which was quite interesting. Melodically sounds quite similar to Leave My Kitten Alone in places. Ultimately though, not a particularly great song. There's a song called I Keep Forgetting. Well, I keep forgetting how it goes because it was very unmemorable. Didn't particularly enjoy that one. Picture Show Life, 80s style. It's big chorus guitars, and it makes it sound fairly modern in places, with the rest of it being more sort of traditional piano based. It wasn't a great song, but I thought it was interesting production choices that put it firmly in the early 80s where it should be. And as you're going to see over the next few minutes as I talk about this and some of the previous albums, Ringo often his songs just felt like they were not right for the era, whereas this did. So I was pleased to hear this. As far as we can go, I could imagine this working well in the hands of a sort of a female balladeer like Barbara Dixon or somebody like that. I didn't think it particularly suited Ringo, but it was clearly a well-written song. Everybody's in a Hurry But Me. It's a jam, features John Entwistle, Eric Clapton. It sounds a bit like Born to Handjive or Willie and the Handjive. And it felt to me like it was just kind of there so that he could have a song with the big names on it. It was kind of ultimately pointless, but it allows him to have the big names there. And going down at the end, well, just went nowhere for me. Didn't particularly enjoy that. Overall, it's a much bluesier album than Ringo had been doing, which is presumably the Joe Walsh effect of him being there. Very hit and miss. I think In My Car and Picture Show Life were the standouts. Ironically, as you'll see going back, I was sort of yearning for a more up-to-date Ringo style. And then now that it's here in certain places, I kind of found myself wanting the old style Ringo back again. But I'm putting this in 12th place. We've then got Ringo entering the 1980s with 1981's Stop and Smell the Roses. Opening song, Private Property, features Paul McCartney. Good catchy up-tempo opener. Rack My Brain, written by George Harrison, and it shows in the melody and the guitar. It is very, very George. I quite liked it. Drumming Is My Madness, just complete and utter Ringo cheese. Not very good cheese. Primula cheese. It was just very cheesy. Attention is another McCartney song. I could imagine this being a good Paul McCartney song. Maybe Pipes of Peace era. I think it would have been much better in Paul's hands though, but you can tell there is a good song there. The execution of it is very safe. Stop and Take the Time to Smell the Roses. This is it's kind of a daft song that I think Ringo would have definitely got away with 8 or 9 years earlier. But it says nothing at all about the early 80s, and it's easy to see why he was sort of so out of favour with record companies and the buying public. It just feels completely out of place to me. Dead Giveaway, nice moody intro. It's a repetitive song, builds nicely throughout. And You Belong to Me, a cover of an old 50s tune. Wasn't entirely unreminiscent of You're 16, You're Beautiful and You're Mine. Again, it would have made a lot more sense, I think, several years earlier, but feels just completely out of place in the early 80s. There's Sure to Fall, the Carl Perkins tune that the Beatles did in the very early days. It was one of the songs that they did at the Decca audition, 1st of January 1962. This recording was produced by Paul McCartney, and he plays bass and piano on it. We've also got Linda McCartney and Lawrence Juba on there, so it's quite interesting for that. You've Got a Nice Way, instrumentally interesting, very well performed. Not the most exciting song, but it feels quite classy, and there's some real nice bass runs in it. We've then got Back Off Boogaloo. Ringo likes to bring this song out every now and again. I said in the first video I'm not particularly fond of the song, never have been. I thought this version was a bit more interesting though, because for no possible reason I can fathom, Ringo decides to quote various Beatles songs at the end of each line. He mentions Help, I'm the Walrus, with a little help from my friends, and a few others. It sort of grabs your attention quite a bit. I guess that's probably why he did it, answering my own question there. Overall, if this was a 1972 album, I would have rated this really highly, because if we're gonna praise albums for being ahead of their time, then I think conversely also albums should be called out when they're way behind the time, as I think this is. It says nothing about the world in 1981. And there's good enjoyable songs on there, but it just feels out of place. So for that reason, I'm putting it in 10th place. We then go back to 1978, Bad Boy. Who Needs a Heart is a decent sort of pop rock song. Good production, I thought, but it lacks a kind of a killer punch. We've then got the title track, Bad Boy, but it's actually a 1957 song by the Jive Bombers. I don't think I've heard the original song, but I guess it's far better than this, which I just thought was a tired effort. Didn't think it was particularly great at all. There's Lipstick Tracers on a Cigarette, which is a cover of a 1962 Benny Spellman song. And again, it just kind of shows, I think, why Ringo was struggling in this era, because it just feels kind of pointless to me. Heart on My Sleeve, it's a cover of a Gallagher and Lyle song. And at this point, I'm just screaming for some of the punk or the new wave of the era to come and rescue me from it. Where Did Our Love Go? Classic song by Holland Dozier Holland. You'll know the Supremes version, of course. Instrumentally, it's more interesting. But again, I'm feeling, what's the point? There's no need for this in 1978. And it feels to me like Ringo's just putting out an album because he has to, not because he's got anything particularly to say. Hard Times is better. It's more upbeat, and I thought that wouldn't have been out of place on Goodnight Vienna or the Ringo album. Tonight is a cover of a Small Faces song from only the year before. Instrumentally, it's a cut above everything on this album. Really good. But I'm finding myself asking the question, what's the point in covering a 1-year-old Small Faces song? Monkey See, Monkey Do, funky vibe that would have fitted well on Ringo IV, which we'll come to soon. Some of the melody feels a bit like George Harrison's Cloud 9, but 10 years earlier. Best song on the album so far. And Old Time Revolving feels like a Sentimental Journey era kind of song, but with a 1970s production. And A Man Like Me, again, a lovely gentle song that sort of, again, it's got vibes of Sentimental Journey, or even Mike McCartney's McGear album, I thought. Overall, Monkey See, Monkey Do and A Man Like Me are the highlights, but overall, it's hard work. And honestly, I really couldn't see the point of much of this album. And it's going in 14th place. We then go back a year to 1977, Ringo Fourth. Drowning in the Sea of Love, very funky. It's a cover of a 1971 song by Joe Simon. Ringo goes disco, and it is a very enjoyable opener. Tango All Night, upbeat, but again, it's a bit cheesy. There's then a song called Wings. It's a good song, but the title is just too distracting for me. He might as well have done a song called Plastic Ono Band. He re-recorded this later on for his Ringo 2012 album. Out on the Streets, well produced. Again, it's funky, but it didn't really do too much for me. Can She Do It Like She Dances? I thought that this would work better in the hands of someone like Leo Sayer. It's like a jaunty piano rocker. It's a decent song, but I felt somebody else might have done it a bit more justice. Sneaking Sally Through the Alley, soul, upbeat, but it's a million miles away from something like an equivalent of, say, Young Americans that David Bowie was doing in a similar era. It's just not in the same stratosphere, or it's trying to be a similar kind of thing. It's No Secret. It's got lovely backing, relaxed. But I left myself wondering, what could this have been in the hands of a great singer? But definitely a highlight of the album. Gypsies in Flight carries on in a similar vein, but the tempo and the vibe just gets brought down a little bit, and therefore it doesn't make it as quite as enjoyable as It's No Secret for me. Overall, fairly enjoyable highs like Drowning in the Sea of Love, Wings and It's No Secret. The rest of it kind of plods along without being great, but without there being anything particularly bad on it either. So I'm putting that in 9th place at the moment. We then have Rotogravure. Is that how you pronounce it? I think that's how you pronounce it. From 1976 anyway. Now, this is an album that I struggle with. I don't enjoy this album much at all, to be honest. I think it's lacking in consistency, and I find it to be the starting point of where Ringo kind of really lost his way for a few years. But you can't deny the historical importance of it because, again, as we'll see with earlier albums, we've got songs written by John Lennon, George Harrison and Paul McCartney on this album. The one bright spot that shines way above everything else on this album for me is the George Harrison song I'll Still Love You. I'm surprised that George didn't want to hang on to it for himself, to be honest. It would have been a great song on one of his albums. A really good moody love song, and it reminds me a little bit of George's own cover of the Hoagy Carmichael song Baltimore Oriole that he did in Somewhere in England a few years later. It's got a great arpeggio guitar riff that reminded me of Eric Clapton's Let It Grow. The rest of the album, I just do not get on well with at all, and I'm putting that in 19th place. I'm going to skip back to 1970 now. I'm going to come back to Goodnight Vienna and the Ringo album at the end. It doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out why I'm doing that. But it's my video. I can do these in any order I like, so there. So, 1970, going back chronologically, we've got Beaucoups of Blues. This was Ringo's second solo album. Very country and western inspired. Ringo went to Nashville to record this and recorded it with the best musicians that you could get. So it instantly gives it a sense of class that it might not otherwise have had. The title track at the start, Beaucoups of Blues, standard country tune, but it is great playing and the style really suits Ringo well. It's a good opening to the album. Love Don't Last Long melodically shares a lot of similarities with a Willie Nelson song, Are You Sure? Which has always been one of my favourites of his. Not quite as well known, I don't think. But it's hard to see. I was thinking at the time listening to this that it's hard to see how a Beatles fan, somebody who's buying this because it's one of the Beatles, would there be that many people who are interested in this style of song? And conversely, would there be too many people who are interested in country and western style at the time who would have been interested in buying an album by an ex-Beatle? I'm not quite sure how the target audience would have reacted to this album. We've then got Fastest Growing Heartache in the West. Now, the quality of the musicianship again shines through here. I would love to have heard a Johnny Cash version of this song with the backing that we've got on here. It would have just sounded absolutely great as a Johnny Cash song. Woman of the Night, I like the pace of this, and there's like a real good sort of tension release in the chorus. Very enjoyable song. We've then got $15 Draw. Now, this has always been by far my favourite song on this album. The guitar feels like Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline era. The song, it suits Ringo down to the ground, and if I was going to put together any kind of best of Ringo or my own favourite Ringo songs, this is nailed on to be in that playlist. As is the last song on this album as well, Silent Homecoming, which is traditionally kind of my other favourite on this album. Now, from the very first moment I heard this song and I heard the acoustic guitar and the bass come in and the way that those two just sounded, I knew I was going to like this song. It builds nicely throughout the verse and it kind of threatens to explode and then it just reins itself back in. Really good closer to the album. So overall, in theory, this album ought to work better than Sentimental Journey that came before it. But there's about half the album that I find myself not particularly drawn to. But I think that's down to me. I think that's down to it being a little bit out of my comfort zone as a musical style, really. You cannot doubt the quality of the musicianship on this album. It is superb. So I think that's probably my undoing rather than an undoing of the album. But I'm putting it in a very creditable 7th place at the moment. We then have Ringo's first solo album. Sentimental Journey, released in March 1970. So Ringo was still technically a Beatle when he recorded this, and I think that lends it some historical weight. The cover there of the Empress pub in the Dingle in Liverpool, which was Ringo's local in his early days. So it's very much kind of big band show tunes, the old style American songbook kind of thing. Opening track, Sentimental Journey, the title song. We have no expectations of what to have from Ringo at this point in his career, but it's a really kind of easy listening version. Ringo saying, step into my world, and it's a good, enjoyable opener. We've then got Night and Day, big band jazz. Think Frank Sinatra. He would have sounded great on this arrangement of Night and Day. Very enjoyable. We've then got Whispering Grass. This was a popular song to cover in the 1970s. Sandy Denny did a great version of it. We had Windsor Davis and Don Estelle. Lovely boy. They did a version of it that did really well in the UK in the charts. Ringo's covering it here. This can't, for me, hold a candle to Sandy Denny's version. That is superb. But this is still very enjoyable. And 3 songs in, it is an enjoyable album, absolutely no doubt. Bye Bye Blackbird. This is the first song that, for me, feels a little bit forced on the album. Comes across a little bit more like it's a musical interlude on Parkinson or the Two Ronnies. Great references there for anybody not in the UK watching this. Stardust, lovely lush orchestration, is a pleasure to listen to, but Ringo sounds a little out of his depth vocally. There's a song called Blue Turning Grey Over You. I'm sure it's a classic song. It does nothing for me. Love is a Many Splendid Thing. Ringo is lower in the mix here, and there's quite a bit of prominence given to the backing singers. Really nice bass sound on this, which in places sounds to me like Carol Kaye's bass sound on Pet Sounds. It's a schmaltz overload, it really is, but I enjoy it. Dream, again, I'm finding the instrumentation to be really enjoyable. It's like lounge jazz. Sounds a little bit to me like parts of the James Bond On Her Majesty's Secret Service soundtrack. You Always Hurt the One You Love. It was hard not to enjoy the up-tempo big band jazz again. But despite Ringo's shortcomings, you'd think, how would this sound if someone like Frank Sinatra was singing it? But it's a great performance by the band, and that shines through. Have I Told You Lately That I Love You? It's a very playful arrangement of this. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, and it deserves some Tom Jones hip swinging. Let the Rest of the World Go By is a downbeat closer, not a favourite of mine. Overall, despite there are definite occasions here when you think Ringo's a bit out of his depth vocally, despite that, it's a very entertaining start, I think, to his solo career. And probably just what he needed to get a bit of confidence as he started post-Beatles life, even though he maybe didn't know for sure that it was post-Beatles life when he recorded it. But I enjoy this album, and I am not ashamed to say that at the moment I'm putting it in 4th place. Well done, Sentimental Journey. Okay, back to those 2 albums that I inexplicably missed out earlier, but we've got 1974's Goodnight Vienna. It starts with the song Goodnight Vienna, written by John Lennon. It's the 2nd album in a row where Ringo has opened with a John Lennon song. And I find that to be a far better song than I'm the Greatest, which opened the Ringo album. Just really gets it off to a great start, I think. Acapella is a strange song. It's got nice sort of soul brass in the intro. The first 30 seconds sounds like the theme tune to a crap 1970s sitcom. It's unusual in its timing, its scanning, its mixture of soul and show styles, but it's definitely a catchy song, and it's hard to dislike. It's worthy nonsense. Ooh-wee! It's got a glam intro. It's a more serious tone before it launches into a kind of a fun sing-along chorus, honky-tonk piano, and really good backing vocals. It's definitely a good song. Husbands and Wives is a definite change of style now. It's kind of a mixture of what he'd done on Sentimental Journey and Beaucoups of Blues. It's kind of in between those two styles. It could have appeared on either. It's a 1966 song by Roger Miller. It's a very charming song, but it's presented in a quite a downbeat manner. But I think that suits the song because the tone of it is to do with a couple breaking up. So, okay, a downbeat manner suits it. Very interesting song. Snookeroo, written by Elton John and Bernie Taupin. Now, I thought with a different lyric, because this lyric was especially written for Ringo, with a different lyric, I think this would have been a very good Elton John single of the early 70s when he was, nobody knew how to churn out a hit single in the early 70s more than Elton John did. It's a great fun song. All By Myself is a fairly unspectacular song and not a favourite of mine. Call Me, it's a decent little song. It starts very basic in its arrangement and then it just kind of subtly grows in its arrangement as it goes, but without ever exploding and becoming a bigger thing. I think it would stand out really well on a lesser Ringo album, whereas it might be a little bit overshadowed here because of the quality of some of the other songs that are around it. No song, absolute nonsense, but in a fun way. Ringo's sort of telling various stories about people offering him things that he's partaken of in the past, but that no, I don't do that no more. It's got a calypso style that makes me wonder whether it's an early example of Ringo starting to make odd, strange song choices, but it's still fun. There's no doubt about that. Only You and You Alone. It's a cover of a 1955 song by the Platters, changed here to a very laid-back 1970s style. It's alright, doesn't enhance my life in any way, but nothing to get worried about. Easy for me, written by Harry Nilsson. Again, it's a Sentimental Journey kind of style of song. Feels a little bit out of place on this album to me, but it's undoubtedly a lovely song. And then we've got a reprise of Goodnight Vienna at the end with John Lennon saying, "With gusto, boys, with gusto," which is quite fun. And it's just like a fun closer. It's a little bit like the reprise of Sgt. Pepper. Overall, it's a very worthy follow-up to the Ringo album. And I don't think this quite has the highs of something like Photograph or Sunshine Life for Me that's on the Ringo album. But I find this album to be a bit more consistent overall. Very difficult for me to separate this and Ringo, so we'll find out soon how I managed to do that. But at the moment, it's going in first place. So we have one album left, Ringo from 1973. Don't forget, after I've done this and ranked this, I will be then in this video throwing the Ringo albums into my John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison ranking to get my final Beatles solo album ranking. What a task that's been. But anyway, back to this album, 1973's Ringo. Starts off with I'm the Greatest, as I mentioned before, written by John Lennon to kick off the album. It's a historically important song. It's the first time that 3 Beatles had appeared on a song since the Beatles split up, because George is on here as well, along with Klaus Voormann and Billy Preston. So it's a very Beatley song. It's a good song, but it's an unusual listen. I think for me, being British, we have a very sort of self-deprecating style of humour, and to hear somebody sort of saying "I'm the greatest," it feels a little bit out of place. But it's still a good song. Have You Seen My Baby? It's a fun rocker by Randy Newman. It's okay, nothing special though. We then have Photograph. I would say quite simply the best song that Ringo Starr has released since the end of the Beatles. It is a superb pop song. Great melody, great chord changes. He wrote it with George Harrison and it features George on guitar and backing vocals. Smashed its way to #1 in the US singles charts and various other countries. Of course, it's the highlight of the album. It's just an absolutely fantastic pop song, no doubt about it. And it follows up the album with another great song, Sunshine Life for Me, Sail Away Raymond. Now, on most other Ringo albums, I think this would be the highlight, but it just kind of gets overshadowed a little bit by Photograph. But what a 2-song run that is. Written by George Harrison again. Now, the Raymond in question was a lawyer that Alan Klein hired to represent John, George and Ringo in their court battle against Paul McCartney. The whole song is in one chord, which gives it a kind of a drone feel, in the same way that Tomorrow Never Knows does. Now, that's probably the end of the similarities with Tomorrow Never Knows, but it's a very interesting musical choice to have it just on one note. And I wondered whether that might be George Harrison's Indian influence coming through, because obviously that's a thing that happens a lot in Indian music. You're 16, You're Beautiful in Your Mind. There's nothing weird at all about a 33-year-old man singing You're 16, You're Beautiful in Your Mind, is there? Well, it's the 1970s. You could do that kind of thing. I'm not going to judge it harshly on that. That the world was a strange place back in the 1970s. Context is everything. But it's a fun song. It's an enjoyable song. Perfect for the album. Ringo might very well have got away with a more traditional production of this on Sentimental Journey. I think it would have fitted there. But I'm glad it's here. Definitely a welcome addition to the album. 6 o'clock. Unmistakably Paul McCartney on the piano for the intro to this song. He wrote the song as well, of course. And if it hadn't have been given to Ringo, it sounds to me like the thing that would have sounded perfect maybe in the medley at the end of Red Rose Speedway. I think it would have been really good there. But instead becomes one of the highlights of this album. And again, it highlights the historical importance of this album, the fact that we have got Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison and Ringo Starr all reunited on this album. Thank you, Ringo, for allowing that situation to happen. Overall, I don't think it's a perfect album, but of course it's a very good album. There's a handful of songs that are okay, if not spectacular. But any album that features Photograph, Sunshine Life for Me, I'm the Greatest, and 6 O'Clock is going to rank highly. So it is up against very stiff competition from Goodnight Vienna. As I mentioned, I think this is a little bit more consistent overall. But I think that the highs on this just allow it just to go first place in my Ringo Starr album ranking. So there's the final ranking for Ringo. And like I say, now I've got the task of fitting these lot into my John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison ranking. So here goes. Here's the bottom of the list so far. You can see this is now going to be a 97 album ranking. We've still got the Beatles to throw into this. Well done to everybody who a long time ago spotted where I was going with the colour scheme for this ranking series. There's a clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. So I don't think anything of Ringo's here gets into the very bottom of this ranking. That's still taken up with some of the more sort of experimental albums by John, George, and classical albums by Paul, for example. So moving our way up, I'm finding that there's actually some sort of quite big gaps in my enjoyment levels of some of the albums where I've actually been able to slot multiple Ringo albums into sort of a gap between two others. And you'll see here as I get to 87th place, The Family Way, Paul McCartney. Above that, I've got the bottom 4 albums from a Ringo ranking. Change the World, Rotogravure, What's My Name, and EP3. We've then got Good Morning New York City by Paul McCartney and Dark Horse by George. Above that, again, I think I can fit in 4 Ringo albums in the gap between Dark Horse and John Lennon's Rock and Roll. We've got the Christmas album there and Old Wave, Bad Boy and Zoom In. We've then got another sort of few albums before a big batch of Ringo albums. And I struggled thinking, is this right that I've grouped so many together? But to be honest, I find all of these albums here more enjoyable than Extra Texture, but not as enjoyable as Paul McCartney's Russian album. So I think I can justify to myself putting a big block of Ringo albums there. And it's kind of easy to see that generally I'm going to enjoy a John Lennon, a Paul McCartney or a George Harrison album more than I'm going to enjoy your average Ringo album. And hence there are going to be quite a lot down in the bottom end of this ranking. Although you'll have seen it didn't get right in the bottom reaches. So well done, Ringo, for that. Moving up to 61st place, Why Not? And 56th place, Give More Love. We then go up a few more places and I felt there was a nice little gap here where I could say, well, I think I enjoy Sentimental Journey more than Paul McCartney's New, but probably not quite as much as Mind Games. So I thought that was a good home for Sentimental Journey. We go up to 46th place, Time Takes Time. And then we've got several more albums before we get to, we're into the top 40 now. And Vertical Man and Ringo Rama both make it into the top 40, which I think, you might think, oh, just scraping the top 40. I think that's a pretty good showing because it's up against some albums that I do certainly enjoy and I've enjoyed for a long time. We've then got a fair old jump again before we find Ringo's, my second place album, Goodnight Vienna. I thought I could justify putting it above George Harrison's self-titled, but probably not above 33 1/3. I think that is another little step up. And then we find that actually my top ranked Ringo album comes in at 26 Ringo, just behind Sometime in New York City, which I continue to be a fan of, and I continue to say how much of a fan I am of it. I don't think some people believe me. But there you see, if I continue up now, we have now finished my 97 album solo Beatles ranking, which has been a mammoth task. Like I say, it's taken me about 5 months to get to this point. But I have got one more video to come in this series, and that is where I'm going to throw the Beatles albums in. And I'm very intrigued to see how that goes, because obviously they're going to be quite high up. But I'm interested more to see how do the best solo albums compete alongside it. One last thing that I want to show you here before we wrap this video up, but I will say thank you very much for watching all this and for all your comments so far. I've been doing like a kind of an average placing. Now this, I'm going to show you two average placings here. The ranking that I've just shown you, if we look at the average ranking for albums by each person, you'll see here that Paul McCartney has an average of 42.8, just in front of George, John Lennon a little bit behind, and Ringo obviously coming down in fourth place. I've then looked at the average placings again, but I've removed all the experimental albums, the classical albums, the live albums, to just focus on studio albums to see what difference that made. And it's made quite a difference. Whereas before Paul and George were very close, there's actually quite a gap now between Paul and George. And that's because of all those classical albums that were down right near the bottom of the list that have now been removed. George really only had one album down there, and that was Electronic Sound. Paul had several. So Paul's taken quite a jump above George now. But John Lennon actually now comes in first place because he had those experimental albums that came before Plastic Ono Band right down at the bottom of the list. Now they're gone. John Lennon's actually in the lead when you look purely at the studio albums. So I thought that was an interesting little alternative view to look at there. So that is my solo Beatles ranking, album ranking. What a task. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know your comments. Here's some other videos that might be of interest, and I will see you very soon. Cheers. Bye.